Now, it's summer camp season, and we're going to be sending off some of our kids. In fact, this afternoon, we're sending our son, and there's some other kids going down to Camp Menasca, and they'll be learning about Jesus, summer camp season, be learning about Jesus, studying the Bible, swimming, singing at the campfire. They'll be eating spaghetti off the table with no silverware. Summer camp. Now, when I was a kid, we went to a camp that was up in the forests of Michigan. And for me, this camp was really out in the middle of nowhere. It was just like complete wilderness. And now I look at the map and I realize it's right next door to Kalamazoo. So it probably was not quite that isolated. But for me, this was like the back 40. It was the wilderness. And I remember one year, and maybe it was like the end of the week, and the counselors had kind of run out of ideas of what to do to keep a couple of hundred kids occupied. But the counselors took us all out into the woods, and it was nighttime, and they said, we're going to try something new. They say, okay, kids, what we're going to do is we're going to walk around the woods, and we're going to go snark hunting. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been snark hunting. The problem that our counselors didn't explain to us about snark hunting, and the first problem was they couldn't quite agree on the description of what a snark looked like. So what should we expect to see? What kind of physical characteristics do the snarks have? And most importantly, do they bite, right? Because we're supposed to be catching these things. And of course, the reason that they couldn't explain what the snarks look like, that little part that they had kind of left out, the reason there was no picture of a snark was because snarks don't exist. Now, interestingly, there were a few sightings of snarks that night. Kids who came back breathlessly to the counselors, right? I remember this, and I think I saw something over there in the bushes. I think it might have been a snark under the bush. Well, most of the time, we need to see something to believe and to understand and to think about it. And so we say, well, show it to me. Show me a picture. What does it look like? What are the physical characteristics? I mean, that's kind of how our human minds work. Seeing is believing. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Show it to me and I can understand it. That's how it works for most things in life. And in fact, if you can't be shown a picture of something, if there's nothing to describe, then there is a really good chance that you are on a snark hunt. And naturally, I think we approach God in the same way. Show God to me. What should we expect to see? What are the physical characteristics of God? What is God like? And for a lot of religions across most of time, it's been possible to show a picture of what their God looks like. Just craft some kind of little statue and just put that statue in a niche in the home or in a temple or carve a pole and put it in a sacred grove. I mean, there it is. That's what our God looked like. So you want to see our God? He's right over there. Take a look and watch for that. And there's a part of us as human beings that I think longs for that image, that longs for something visible and tangible, something that we can wrap our minds around. That over there is my God. That's what he looks like. But what's interesting in the Ten Commandments, this heart of hearts of the Old Testament, is that God speaks to the people and says, you shall have no other gods before me. But then God continues and says, you shall not make for yourself an idol. In other words, you will not have a visible representation of any other God or of God himself. And in some ways of counting, the commandment to not make an idol is really an extension of the commandment to have no other gods before God. It's kind of all wrapped into one. We just worship God. And in the Catholic Church, these commandments are all counted as one. And they then see the last commandment, the commandment about coveting, they split that into two, right? So you don't covet your neighbor's spouse or your neighbor's house. It's two commandments in their way of counting. But we're going to follow the traditional way that sees this as two separate commandments. No other gods before God, and then also do not make an idol. We're going to see that as two different things. And I think there's a number of reasons for this second commandment, and perhaps the most important of them all is that God calls us to trust, not control. Now, if you look at Deuteronomy 5, verse 8, you'll see how this unfolds. It says, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to the 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, this has a couple of basic things, maybe two parts to it. The first one is that you shall not make an image of any other god, right? And in this sense, it's obviously related to the first commandment, right? You shall not worship other gods. You'll also not make an image of the other god, because you often would need an image in the ancient world to be able to know who you are worshiping. It's kind of this commandment about being completely and loyal to the one and only God. But the second meaning is not even making an image of the God. It's even being committed just to the God of Israel. It's saying you shall not make an image of him. The Lord God who drew the people out of slavery, the one who the New Testament calls the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. We don't make images of that God. So it's not just that it's bad to make images of other gods, it's that it's bad to make an idol of the true God. And for me, this is where it really gets interesting. Because if God is real, and if we believe in God, well, then why wouldn't we want to make an image of him, right? I mean, show me what God looks like. I think there's a really deep need for us as human beings to see God. Why wouldn't we want to make an image of God? I think there's a deep human need to have a way to conceptualize and visualize God. I mean, if you just look at the scriptures, you see this over and over again. I mean, think about the irony of the golden calf and the scene in Exodus 32. It's at the very moment, you know this story, right? It's the very moment when Moses is up on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. He's receiving the 10 commandments, the commandments that start off saying, you will not make an idol. At that very moment, as he's receiving those commandments, the people are at the bottom of the mountain making an idol. And there's this human need, I think, not just to see, but to worship. And so with Aaron's help, they make a golden calf. I mean, this is Aaron, right? It's Moses' brother. You would think he would get it. He's the man who becomes the foundation of the line of priests who will serve God. And Aaron says in Exodus 32, he says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he builds an altar, and he offers sacrifice, and he dedicates a day to the Lord. And think about this. We are so used to reading this story that we might not even notice that a lot of what Aaron does is actually pretty good. I mean, he leads the people to worship God, the properly identified God who brought them up out of the land of Egypt. He sets a whole day aside for worship. It's kind of like Sabbath. It's not even totally clear what Aaron had in mind when he made those calves. I once heard a Bible scholar explain that Aaron wasn't trying to tell them to worship the calf, but was saying worship the invisible God who sits atop the calf, sort of like how God's footstool was the golden cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant. I don't know. But of course, what Aaron does leads to deep problems and ultimately to idolatry. And this is why when Moses comes down the mountain, he sees that golden calf. He is just consumed with fury. And he takes those tablets and he throws them down and he breaks them, right? And the interesting thing is that this tells us that it's possible to be idolatrous even towards God. Now, the Hebrew word that is translated here for idol, you shall not make for yourself an idol, that Hebrew word is the word for carve or cut. And the old King James version, you probably remember this, it says, you shall not make for yourself a graven image, right? A graven image. And I kind of like that because graven sounds like engraved. So something that's chiseled, something that's engraved. It's actually the same word that God uses when he tells Moses to carve or engrave 2 stone tablets and take them up so that God can write the 10 commandments on them, right? So carve, cut. But almost beyond that, almost every time in the Old Testament when this word is used, it's used to talk about making an idol. So it's carving a pole to the goddess Asherah, or it's Isaiah talking about how a craftsman will carve a little statue of a god out of mulberry wood. So it's not a word that's used for like carving a duck decoy. It's like carving an image of a god or of the God. Now in Deuteronomy 4:12, God says that the people of Israel were gathered at the base of Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, and they saw no form, but they only heard the words of God. And I think part of what that means is that God is transcendent. God is the one who reveals himself to us. God takes the initiative. God is not just whatever we choose to imagine him as. So 1 John 4:12, no one has ever seen God. Or 1 Timothy 1:17 says that God is the King of the ages, immortal, invisible, the only God. And when the scriptures tell us that God is invisible, they're not saying that God just chooses not to show up, that God chooses not to be seen. It's bigger than that. God is invisible in the sense that our eyes, or all of our senses really, are never able to fully grasp and comprehend who God is. And we can say some right things about God, and we can definitely say some wrong things about God, but we can never fully take God in, fully see God. So show me God is kind of like saying, show me infinity, or show me the universe. Those are things that by their nature simply are not visible. They're not something that we can hold in our minds. And God is greater than the universe. And what this means is that whatever image we might make of God will always fall short. It will always be inadequate. And what's more, our images can even lead us astray. So think of King Jeroboam's golden calves in 1 Kings chapter 12. After King Solomon, the nation of Israel splits into two, right? So you've got Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and Jeroboam is the king of the people to the north, and he knows that because Jerusalem and all the parts of worship, the priesthood, the altars, the temple, all that's in Jerusalem, he knows that if the people are going to worship God, they're going to be leaving him behind and going down to that kingdom. And so he says, they're going to kill me, and they're just going to reunite, and so what I've got to do is set up some place for them to worship. And Jeroboam creates these altars and these golden calves at Bethel and at Dan. And so he installs priests, he makes offerings, he follows a sacred calendar. But the problem, this is in 1 Kings 12, the problem is that then the people begin to think that those calves are the image of their God. And they start to get led astray by that. You know, part of the reason is that it's so easy to be led astray by images is because the way we perceive things has so much to do with the context, right, with what's around us. So just, for example, take a look at this image. This is an optical illusion. It was created by a guy named Brian Den. And in this picture, do you see those letters A and B? Can you see those letters on there? Now, A and B are on some squares. It's kind of got this checkerboard, and maybe you've seen something like this before. But A and B are actually the exact same color. The B looks lighter because A, in our mind, we're compensating for the shadow that we believe is being cast by that green cylinder. So if you would take a sampling tool in your Adobe Photoshop or whatever, and you'd sample that, you'd see it's the exact same color, but our eyes see it as two different colors, right? It's impacted, the context makes us see it differently. Or take this picture back in 2015. Some of you may remember this, right? This was a famous picture of this dress that somebody posted online, and this image went viral because, strangely, people had wildly different perceptions about the color of this dress. So some people saw a blue dress with gray stripes. I don't know if that's what you see. Some people saw a white dress with gold stripes. So I don't know which one you see, gold and white, or blue and gray. How many see blue and gray? How many see white and gold? A few of you do. Well, it turns out this went so far, you probably remember this, they went and asked the manufacturer of the dress, like, what color is it? And the manufacturer confirmed that it is in fact blue and gray, which is what I saw. But seeing is believing, right? But which is it, right? Seeing is believing, or maybe not so much, because it turns out that so much of what we see is impacted by the context that we see it in, or the context we find ourselves in, or our preconceived notions, right? And these are just, I was just showing you some optical illusions, right? Those are just for fun. They don't make any difference in life, unless, of course, you're trying to coordinate with your dress. But they don't make much difference. But when it comes to God, there is a risk of being deceived by images, and that risk is very much greater. There's a lot more at stake. And I think as human beings, we're always at risk of being carried away by a false image of God. We think we can get a lock on God. We think we've got God all wrapped up, but oftentimes these are images that will lead us astray. Now, of course, one person's image of God is another person's idol. I remember once we took a tour of an ancient temple complex, the Chan Chan complex in Peru, and there are these clay statues at one end of this old mud brick temple, and the guide went to great pains to emphasize that those statues over there in this temple, those are not idols, he told us. Those are just images of their God. Or our friends in the churches in Peru, I mean, they're very sensitive to images. They're probably a lot more sensitive than we are. I mean, they don't even like to have a cross in their churches. They see a cross as being too close to idolatry, while for us, a cross is this image, this symbol that points to the invisible God. But think of ancient Israel. There were times when people got the idea that their God was simply the God of their nation, simply one more tribal god among many who is duking it out among the other gods and the other tribes. This is like what happened in the time of the prophet Jeremiah, when the prophet said that God was going to use the nation of Babylon to conquer Judah and to destroy Jerusalem, but the people wouldn't believe him. And they kind of had this chant. You read in the prophet Jeremiah, they'd say, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, right? I mean, God lived in Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It's like our idol. The city of God will never fall. The temple will never be destroyed. And it turned out their image of God was far too small, that they had made an idol even of the city itself. Or think of the story much earlier when Judah and Israel and Edom, they go to fight against Moab in 2 Kings 3. And at the end of that story, it seems like the wrath of God gets turned around and it's directed against Israel and Judah because they had gone too far in destroying Moab. They thought their God was a tribal deity, that God would always fight for them, always be on their side, that God would hate their enemies as they hated them. And it turned out they had made an idol of God. Instead of this tribal God, this is the God who Psalm 115:3 says, the Lord is in the heavens, he does whatever he pleases. You know, I wonder how often we do this. How often do we think that God is a God of our side? God's a God of our political party, our nation. You know, I think this has happened sometimes when people claim that, our nation, right? Our nation is on the side of God, or God's on the side of our nation. We're, Christian nation or something like that. But then tend to forget that there's this tragic history, this lamentable history of eliminating the Native Americans, or allowing slavery, or invading other countries, or right now separating parents and children seeking asylum on the southern border. And these are not things that honor God. And I think there are long-term repercussions on the soul of the nation and all of our souls as individuals. And that's not to say that there are not so many ways that our nation has been blessed, has reflected that of God, has been a mercy. Those are certainly out there. They're right to recognize and to love those things. But there's a dangerous kind of smugness that can take over when we think we've got God figured out, which usually means that we think we've got God unequivocally on our side. I think sometimes there's a lack of a spirit of repentance and humility that morphs into that most ancient sin, idolatry. Now, it's easy to go down, to start thinking like this and to go down the rabbit hole of relativism, to start to think that since it's impossible to contain God in an image, then it's impossible to speak with any certainty at all, to know who God is, even to know the difference between right and wrong. But that's not it at all. What not making graven images really tells us is that our attempts to make images of God will always in some way fall short. And one of the reasons they will fall short is because an image of God is really an attempt to control God. It's an attempt to put God in a box, to create a portable sort of God that can be understood and figured out and ultimately controlled in some way. We just cart him out whenever we need him. But above all else, God refuses to be controlled or contained. Just asked the Israelites what happened when they took the Ark of the Covenant out to fight against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4. But that very human desire to know and see and wrap our minds around God never goes away. In John 14, Philip comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, show us the Father, right? Show us the Father and we will be satisfied. That's all he wants. See God. It's only natural. But Jesus says to him, don't you know that who I am after all this time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus says, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Jesus says that it is the Father who is living in him, speaking through him, working through him. And you see, one of the central claims of the New Testament is what Paul wrote in Colossians 1:15. Paul said that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the imago Dei, the image of God, the icon of God. Jesus is a living icon. So Jesus is saying, and Paul after him, if you have seen Jesus, you have seen God. Now, not God in God's totality, not everything there is to see and know about God, but enough to know how to live, to follow his example, to grasp an understanding of who God's character is. And this is why Jesus says in John 14 that if you don't believe that God the Father is in him, at least believe him because of the works, right? Which NIV translated that as miracles, but the literal word is the works. Believe me because of the works. And in Jesus, we see the works of God. We see how God acts. Jesus is the living image of God, but he's not an image like the kind that people have tried to create of God out of precious metal or out of wood. Jesus is not some new and improved golden calf. Jesus, as the image of God, goes far deeper, far beyond what we can see. He's the image of God who shows us the way of life that is godlike, the way of life that opens up a pathway to God. Jesus is the image of God that is actually God present among us. You know, there's a big risk of idols. The big risk of idols is that they objectify God. And Jesus has come so that we might enter into a living relationship with the living God. Idols make God an it, and God is not an it. God is a living being who desires to be in relationship with us. Jesus is the image of what it looks like to perfectly trust God. And when we follow him, we're brought into that perfect relationship between the Father and the Son. So it's not about seeing God in a physical sense. It's about having this walk with God, this relationship. And you know, this is where sometimes disillusionment can be a gift. Because it's literally the undoing of our illusions, our false images of God, our false images of life, of what we're owed, of who we are. Disillusionment can sometimes be a gift because it can usher us into a space where we have a chance to reconsider, to get a fresh understanding of who God is and who we are in relationship to him. And I don't like it. I do not like to be disillusioned any more than I imagine any of you do. But sometimes we need a good old-fashioned bracing disillusionment so that we can get a fresh understanding of God. Author D.L. Mayfield writes about how she grew into a more complicated vision of who God is and what it takes to walk with God in righteousness. And Ms. Mayfield sets out to be a missionary among Somali immigrants in Portland, Oregon. Her understanding of her role among them was transformed as she came face to face with the trauma of migration, the grinding challenges of poverty, and the ways that her own whiteness and relative affluence privileged her and allowed her to make decisions that those around her could not. And her disillusionment with her self-image was what allowed her to really start relating to those around her in her low-income community where she and her family had moved. And then that's when Mayfield came to see how her simple vision of God and of herself had to change. And she writes this: I didn't see how I placed myself at the top and was eager for others to do the same. I didn't see how that meant that my neighbors and refugee friends became my stepping stones in attaining the love of God. But in the strange way that freedom comes, the worse my life started to look on paper, the more I started to find the God I'd been looking for all of my life. Friends, where do those idols, those false images of God need to be torn down in our own lives? those false images that try to lock down the love of God and lock in our own self-images, where do you need to move from control to trust? Where do you need to trust in the invisible God whose love was perfectly revealed in his living image, Jesus? You shall not make for yourself an idol, God spoke on the mountain. How will you live by this word? Amen.